I felt like I had to like hold on to my sofa because I felt like if I didn't, it would I don't know, I would explode or something would happen. I know it sounds very dramatic, but like honestly, it felt this dramatic. This was genuinely a point at which I believed that levitation exists.
Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer. Buddha at the Gas Pump is an ongoing series of conversations with ordinary spiritually awakening people. And I was just joking about that with my guest. And we've done about 750 of them now. So if this is new to you and you'd like to check out previous ones, you just go to batgap.com and you'll see them organized in various ways. These conversations are made possible through the support of appreciative listeners and viewers. All donations are tax deductible. If you would like to donate, please visit batgap.com for more information. So my guest today is a delightful person named Maggie Gilewicz. Did I pronounce that correctly, Maggie? Gilewicz?
Almost. Gilewicz.
Gilewicz, like a V sound.
But most people say Gilewicz or Gilewicz, which is fine. Kind of a witch at the end, basically. Okay.
Whichever way you say it is okay.
Yes.
And Maggie's going to tell us a lot about herself, but she's a transformational coach. She's an astrologer. Is that Western or Jyotish?
No. Well, it's Hellenistic astrology. I use whole sign system. So it's kind of closest to Jyotish, I would say.
Alrighty. Jyotish, for those who don't know, is Vedic astrology. And is that your main way of earning a living? The way Angelo is an anesthesiologist, but he's also a spiritual guide? Or because your website, if anybody goes to your website, it's all about astrology. But we're probably going to hardly talk about astrology today.
Yes, good. Not that I'm happy to talk about astrology, but it's sort of half and half. I mix both. Most people that I'm seeing are really not there just for astrology. They're for both astrology and sort of support in their awakening journey. Yeah.
Right. Okay. It's a good tool to have in your toolbox.
And it's really useful.
Yeah. And you're an author. I read your book called Awakening to be Human, which I really enjoyed. And the title is significant because you're devoted to humanizing awakening, which can sometimes seem rather dehumanizing.
Right.
Yeah. So you see yourself not as a guru, obviously, but as a supporter and guide, walking alongside others through the parts of the journey that you have traveled yourself, sharing insights you've gained along the way. You have a PhD in sociology and a rather checkerboarded educational background, which we might get into, and a master's degree in political science. And you are a lover of simplicity, learning, and laughter. And the laughter part and the other parts will also be more and more evident throughout this interview. You have a nice sense of humor and a nice laugh.
Thank you. It was great. It was actually great to get to laugh a bit before we started.
Yeah.
It made me less nervous.
Good. Yeah. There's that humanizing part. You admit to being nervous.
Yeah, exactly. Totally.
Yeah. So your book had a kind of a chronological order to it, tracing your decade-long, sometimes difficult process. Mm-hmm. But one thing I liked about it, which we've already alluded to, is that you frame awakening not as some kind of transcendent escape, but rather as perhaps a growth into greater or fuller humanness. Mm-hmm. Yes? Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah. I mean, my own view of awakening before my own awakening, which I have no idea where I inherited that view from, was that awakening was, first of all, some kind of transcendent state, first and foremost, that one reaches, and that whoever reaches that state is somehow special. In other words, they must have something that the regular person doesn't have, that allows them to reach that transcendental state or something. And so, of course, with awakening, I would equate, gurus that dress up a certain way, talk a certain way. First of all, people who lead spiritual lifestyles, generally speaking, travel to India, do yoga, meditate, they're sort of devoted to the whole thing. And this idea that this awakening / enlightenment were happening to like regular people like myself, like it would just never occur to me, which is probably one of the reasons why I wouldn't even seek it in the first place, because I immediately kind of, due to my own kind of ideas about it, I felt already kind of excluded from the get-go, as like mere mortal who this has nothing to do with, Yeah.
That was one of my motivations for starting this show, as I've said before on this show, because I live in a town where, several thousand people have been meditating for decades, and people were having spiritual awakenings, really significant, abiding awakenings. And I was in this little discussion group with a bunch of people, and someone that reported that they would tell friends about an awakening they'd had, and the friends would put them down. They'd say, "Oh no, you're just Joe Schmo. You're a regular person. I know. I've known you for years. You couldn't this couldn't possibly have happened to you." And and you still have this fault or this hang up or whatever. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to start an interview show where I showcase these people. I allow people to see that their peers, people like them, are having spiritual awakenings, and that will instill greater confidence that they too could have one.
Yeah. And I'm grateful for that, which was one of the reasons why I was drawn to your YouTube channel, and I love the name so much, Buddha the Gas Pump. By the way, I didn't tell you that I was playing with AI one day, and I actually prompted to create a logo of what it would create if I prompted it to do Buddha the Gas Pump, and I had a whole plan to like do the logo, send you a T-shirt or something like that, but the plan collapsed for some reason. I don't know why. But yeah, I mean, I'm so grateful that you started this podcast or channel, and to show that this is actually this whole awakening is happening to regular people. And I think often people may have experiences, really profound experiences, without the language or reference, and not even knowing that whatever they experience is called an awakening. But to be honest with you, I think that idea that this is a transcendent state that happens only to certain type of people still persists. I've seen it multiple times.
Yeah, there's a deep cultural bias or, assumption that would take some undoing. And, there's nothing wrong with transcendent states, but they need to be fully integrated. And, one can be playing a rigorous game of tennis while, on some level appreciating a transcendent field of silence, while they're jumping around and sweating and, slamming the ball.
Yes.
It's not incompatible. But if tapping into some transcendent state makes you feel like you just need to sit like a marshmallow all the time with your eyes closed, or keep insisting that the world is an illusion and it's you're not interested in it or anything like that, then maybe there's some integration yet to be accomplished.
Yeah, which is probably why I know that some people are fed up with this word, but this is precisely why it's a journey. It's not a sort of one-off event. And I think, I honestly think that most people go through all these stages, the thinking that they arrived, or they're sort of done, or, going through this sort of, I myself went through a whole stage of like, well, this is all just an illusion / just a thought, and, lived from that place, being completely disassociated from my own suffering and emotional pain and all sorts of stuff that I had to deal with later on, So I think even the annoying bits about this journey, or the things that annoy us in people, when we see them act certain way, they too are part of that process,
I think you'll probably agree that what we're talking about here and what all the people who are interested in this stuff are actually talking about is an innate human capacity for development, something that any and everyone has the hardware to realize, to experience, to develop. It's not extraordinary. It's not special. I mean, it might be rare, but it's not unnatural or special in any way. Would you agree with all that?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I can't actually see it any different, you know. I just think that um everyone has the capacity to sort of remember who we really are, you know. It's just a case of some people are more or less interested to find out, you know, and whether their trajectory plays out in such a way that they do start seeking and they do start asking those questions and they do get curious for whatever reason. That's one thing, um but even the people who are, at least the way I see it, even the people who are not interested in this stuff and are not seeking, they're still that, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think it's just if we say they're not interested, I think we could probably add yet. They will
Mm-hmm.
be eventually. Um, maybe not even in this lifetime, but it's something that I think ultimately everyone is destined to get interested in and to realize.
I mean, I don't know about that. I would have hoped so because it really makes um it certainly fundamentally changes the way you perceive life and experience life, you know, for the better. That doesn't mean that life becomes a smooth ride and there are no challenges or anything like that, but it certainly helps, you know.
Yeah.
So,
And if what we're talking about is your essential nature, if it's what you ultimately are, then what are you looking for? You know, you're looking for happiness here and happiness there and this experience and that experience. And those things all give you little bits of it, but you
mm,
know, all the traditions say that there's an ocean of it, you know,
yeah.
at your foundation, in your deepest nature, and why settle for little drops when you can have the ocean?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think for so many people, you know, we start searching in different places, you know, in the material world, you know, the imagining the okay, this kind of success is gonna fulfill me, and this kind of car and this kind of house and this kind of relationship and so on. Then and that may be even the case for many people, but often they find out that that's not enough, and usually, you know, the search for something else begins, you know. And for other people it happens kind of spontaneously, god knows for what reason, and for other people maybe tragedy strikes or something like that, and that triggers that kind of curiosity, you know. So I find it just incredibly fascinating how different people are, you know, and how different are people's trajectories and how it plays out for different people, you know.
Yeah, I do too. And what you just said, I was talking about this with a friend the other day. You know, the difficulties, the suffering. Um,
Hmm.
you know, maybe that serves as a catalyst or stimulus for being interested in this. And maybe the fact that things seem to be getting so crazy on an international level these days
Hmm.
is a harbinger of a big shift underway in collective consciousness and in society.
Yeah, for many for sure. Yeah, for many
Hmm.
for sure, and especially um you know, with especially with AI, or even just with the AI alone, you know, there is a real crisis of people not knowing what's real anymore, and that actually really messes with their heads. Um, and so for many, you know, mm, it's kind of sad, you know, that sometimes really horrible things have to happen, whether it's globally or in our personal lives, that sort of are a wake up call and actually even open us up to questioning like what's actually true, you know. and it's unfortunate that it has to happen sometimes this way, but at the same time I'm really glad that it happens, because that's when that change happens.
Yeah, I mean, having read your book, I know that you went through a lot of difficult times, and as did I when I was young. And those things served as a goad, you could say, to find out what the heck is going on, and why can't it be better than this? Why does it have to be like this?
Yeah. I mean, I think I don't know where I shared this, or even whether I talked about it. No, I think I did talk about it in the book. That, like, from the beginning, I never felt like I belonged here in some way, you know? Like, there was a sense of, like, I knew obviously that my parents were my parents and my sister was my sister, but like, who were they actually? Like, and how did I end up here? I remember sort of wondering about that, and then always wondering about certain rules, whether in society or in school, and always questioning them, and therefore obviously being considered a troublemaker or a difficult, quote unquote, difficult person, because I was questioning stuff. And so yeah, so from the beginning, I felt a bit like, what is going on here? What is this about? And always, um, I feel like I've always been seeking something beyond, or some kind of, that there had to be something more meaningful than just the surface or something like that. Is the best way I can put
Yeah.
it.
I think a lot of people listening to this will be able to relate to that. I interviewed
Yeah.
someone a couple of months ago named Emmeline Lambert, who said that, when she was young, she said to her parents, you're not really my parents. And incidentally, I'm from Mars. I'm not even from this planet.
Oh
I don't
God.
belong here. I don't know what I'm doing here. And
And what was their
she could never.
reaction to that?
They just thought she was a crazy little kid, didn't
Oh,
take it too
okay.
seriously. But she always felt like, there was a book by Robert Heinlein, I think it was called Stranger in a Strange Land. And, that's what a lot of spiritual seekers feel like. They feel like, how did I end up on this planet? And what's it all about?
Yeah. But even things like, I could never quite get along with my peers, like people same
Right.
age. I was always drawn to talking to older people. And if I remember when I was like maybe 6 years old, I ended up in hospital having I don't know, I think it's called tonsillitis, one of
Right.
those
Yeah.
removed. And there was a kids ward, and then there was the adults ward, and I would spend all my time with the adults. Like, I would just sit at the end of the bed with the elderly people, and I would just chat. I mean, they probably were like exhausted but by the time I left, because I kept on asking them a million questions and eating snacks that their family brought them. And also, so I was really not interested in chatting to my peers. I was always interested in talking to elderly people, and I had incredible sensitivity to elderly people's suffering. To this day, I don't quite understand why that. I mean, I've always been a sensitive kid, but for some reason, elderly suffering or aloneness, especially if they were alone and no one to look after them, it would like really get me really deeply for some reason.
Nice. I remember when I was a kid, there was a doctor who lived across the street, a retired doctor named Dr. Dowd, and he had a son, I guess it was, who had cerebral palsy or something, which was a little scary for me because the guy talked funny and everything. But I used to go to his house all the time and just ask him questions, tell me about whales, how come they squirt that water out the top of their, and what, all kinds of things would come to mind. We just have these long conversations.
Yeah. I think very fondly about that.
Yeah.
But we both grew up with alcohol addiction in the family, so that we have in common, and obviously the all sorts of unpredictability and volatility that comes with that. So yeah, definitely not fun, that part.
Yeah. So there's something in my notes on your book about when you were a teenager. Peace with a capital P on the post office steps. What was that happening? That happened on the post office steps.
So this had to do with my father was an alcoholic, and this was one of those days where he came back home drunk, basically, after a long break from drinking, where I kind of hoped that he was done. But he wasn't, and I was just completely distraught by that, because I was really invested in, like, you know, reading all the books about alcohol addiction and trying to be supportive and all of that.
Hmm.
Um, and I just remember just being really, really distraught, and there was just like turmoil at home, and I stepped out of the house and basically was walking down the street and met a friend, and the conversation with him was like really, really impactful, because he told me that I just can't control this situation and I have to look after myself. And for someone still very young, this was there was more said, but like those were like real words of wisdom that really stayed with me. And as I was coming back home, I was walking back, something basically happened where all of a sudden I just saw my entire family as completely innocent.
Hmm.
My mother, my father, my sister, and like whatever we were all doing, we were not doing it on purpose, and that it was sort of a result of some kind of learned conditioning. Obviously, I wouldn't use those words at the time, but I kind of see it that way now. And this was, well, incredibly impactful, for one, because all of a sudden the there was a burden of some kind that lifted, because I blamed my father for drinking. I still thought that if he really cared about us, he would have stopped, but he didn't. And so it's hard for me to remember like the details, but the reason why it was impactful is because all of a sudden um I saw that inherent innocence of all of us, really. And then, yeah, some kind of a burden that came with that lifted, and any kind of sense of victimhood also dropped in that moment. And there was what I can describe my first glimpse of peace with capital P, which was a kind of peace that's unconditional and sort of unaffected by anything that goes on either in my head or in my life. So it's kind of there even in the midst of a psychological turmoil at home and so on. So that's what that was about.
Yeah. I know in my father's case, he fought in World War II and he was an artist by profession, sensitive guy, intelligent guy. But here he
Hmm.
was flying in bombers and shooting down planes and being shot at and all that stuff. And he just got so stressed out by it. And, I'm sure that led to his alcoholism. And, it's like people do the best they can. And it may not
Yeah.
seem like that, but does anyone intentionally say, I'm going to really screw up on purpose here and make my life miserable? No, you try to do the best you can. And, people are burdened with a lot of trauma and a lot of difficulties that it's easier said than done to just snap out of it.
Yeah, no, it's not. And especially where addiction is concerned, it certainly isn't a case of just like, well, you could just not, if it was this easy, then we would not deal with this problem, at all. But yeah, I'm just, I'm grateful that I kind of had that glimpse into it for whatever reason early on, so to speak, because it really um, spared me from a lot of um, maybe certain burdensome thoughts, not just about my family, but about myself. And like it really had a massive impact, that insight, just
That's
overall.
great. That's one interesting thing about you. You haven't done much actual spiritual practice, as I understand it. I heard you say in your book at one point that you never had meditated, but
Never, no.
your main engine seems to be insight. You just kind of you have a really bright mind, and you read things, and you really take them to heart, or you listen to things, and somehow just those insights that you gain from your exploration create significant shifts in your experience.
Yeah,
You think?
I suppose it's kind of interesting because yeah, now that you put it that way, yes, because like I said, in many ways, now when I look back, I've always been seeking something, something deeper,
Right.
something beyond just the surface, right? Even though if you had asked me at the time, I wouldn't have said that. I wasn't aware that that was going on, but I was always kind of inquisitive and not quite satisfied with just any answer, let's put it this way. And so I was, I spent so many years in academia, academic research, academic kind of thinking, academic inquiry. So there was no place in my life for spirituality. I was not and again, for the reason, I don't know, did we talk about it before we started or after we started? The fact that I've inherited those ideas about awakening, that this is reserved for certain kind of
I think
people.
it was since we've started. Yeah. People who float 2 feet off
So
the ground and glow in the dark.
exactly. So exactly. So I would also, and I really consider myself sort of slightly walking with my head in the clouds, but firmly with my feet firmly on the ground. I would describe myself that way. So like inquisitive, but also skeptical, cynical, verging on cynical, and often considering myself very open-minded, but also very closed-minded when I look back in terms of all sorts of other things. But I really think that one of the reasons that I've not been seeking, maybe I would have, was precisely because I had this idea that spirituality and awakening is for a certain kind of person, and that person definitely wasn't me, and so not an ordinary someone, who just lives life, human life, has human concerns, things like that. So and that went on for years and years and years until there came a point where on the outside my life seemed to be great. Everything I was doing was going great, my lifestyle, whatever, but I was like really, really unhappy. And it was just very obvious that I need some kind of help, but I wouldn't know what kind of help to even look for. Um, I wouldn't even consider therapy or anything like that at the time. I just felt like I needed some help. So I went to my go-to, source, books. This is where where I go. So I bought some books. The spiritual books completely put me off. They kind of the whatever spiritual books I read, I think it was Osho, but I wouldn't bet on that. Some book by Osho and something else. And the language just put me off. And I'm like, what the hell does it have to do with like regular human life? Like, how does this relate to like I said, human regular life? I couldn't find the connection. So then I, reached out for self-help, which, for the academic that I was, it was just totally below me to, read self-help, because I considered like the pseudo psychology for the masses, and like I was just so like full of myself, my God. But anyway, um, but I ended up, this one book was just really like nagging me. There was this one book on Amazon constantly being like recommended. And so I bought it, and I read it, and it was just, I'm just kind of making a long story very short. And that opened up an inquiry as to like, it was the first time in my life that I started asking myself, what do I actually want? Where am I actually going? Because I realized I never asked myself this question really, that I was kind of living on autopilot. And that's how I started working with the Michael that you asked me about, and that led to my first shift. But even then, Rick, I never considered the first shift an awakening. To me, it was just I refer to it as a fundamental shift in perception. That's it. I never seen it as a spiritual event, and I've never seen it as, therefore now I'm an awakened spiritual person. Not at all.
Yeah, as I recall, you had that shift. You were in Phoenix and you're having lunch or
Yes.
something with Michael,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden
Yeah.
your whole appearance changed. You said your eyes were sparkling, and so
Yes.
try to describe that shift a little bit more. I mean, you were just probably chewing on your salad or something, and all of a sudden this thing happened spontaneously. I think there's probably an underlying mechanism for why these things happen. They're not just random occurrences. And the intensity of your search up to that point probably created enough pressure or momentum or something that little breakthrough could happen. But try to elaborate. I mean, enable us to see it through your eyes. Exactly how did your perspective change or your perception?
Okay, so I first want to say something that you mentioned, that like absolutely it wasn't like random. So even though I didn't have a spiritual practice of any kind, and I have never meditated in my life or had spiritual practice, but one could say that the inquiry that I did with the mentor that I was working, because he wasn't a spiritual teacher, he was a coach, right? He was a transformative coach, and the only thing he was pointing to all the time was the nature of thought. And to look prior to any thought, to look in the direction prior to any thought, right?
Yeah.
And and the other thing that he was pointing to was that there's basically this wholeness, that we're inherently whole, and that when we see into the nature or beyond the thought, we discover this inherent wholeness, right? So really, that's what he was trying to point me to during our conversations. We talked about other things, but this was a kind of an inquiry. So, okay, we may not call it strictly spiritual practice, but I would say now in retrospect, it was a kind of a inquiry. It was a practice of inquiry into this nature of thought.
I mean, that's a common word for a certain spiritual path.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's very valid.
Yeah. So again, either way, it was a kind of a profound inquiry into the nature of thought, and basically what would my experience of life be like without any thought? Any thought about myself, any thought about circumstances, like what would be like to actually just see what is without any thought about it, without any label, and so on, right?
Without interpretation. Yeah, it kind of sounds a little like Byron Katie. Where would you be without that thought? She always says.
Exactly. And in fact, I was introduced at that time to Byron Katie as well. And not as in like in person, but like I found out about her existence. Yeah, her teachings. And I have to tell you, Rick, I did not enjoy it. I did not enjoy this process because I could sense that he was pointing to something that was absolutely true in a non-intellectual way. And all I had was my intellect to rely on, and it wasn't getting me there, So I was really annoyed. I was really frustrated because I kind of knew what he was saying, but I wasn't really getting it, which is what I would put as the difference between basically the intellectual understanding and an insight, or a direct insight, something like that. So I was incredibly frustrated because I was hitting the wall. Basically, my brain was just was failing me, and that was really annoying, and so. I could understand it already. Like, come on, and the more I tried to, like, the more I, pushed, the more confusing the whole thing was getting. So by the time I ended up in Arizona, I kind of gave up on trying to understand it. I was so exhausted by this inquiry that I kind of gave up for a moment and went to this like workshop that was not related to that inquiry with him. And we were chatting over lunch about something completely unrelated. And all of a sudden, basically in a split second, like I said, my perception shifts so fundamentally that I'm just seeing life without thought for the first time in my life. And and all of a sudden, all my problems that were still there and all this pressure to fix things and work on things and fix that and get rid of that, like all that urgency that was there prior, you know, it was just gone. It was nothing looked like a problem anymore. It wasn't a denial, by the way. It wasn't like I went into some kind of denial place. The circumstances of my life were still there as they were before that insight, but nothing looked problematic. Nothing looked burdensome anymore. And that's when that experience of peace with capital P that I had a glimpse of for the first time as a teenager kind of emerged fully.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it was just.
I think giving up is a key element here. Giving up can't be the first. Yeah, giving up can't be the first step, but after all that intense striving, then giving up can bear fruit. And I can think of examples like Adyashanti, for instance, was gung ho. He had to be the most vehemently intense Zen meditator, and he would just try to out meditate everybody else or whatever. And finally he got to the point where he was thinking he was going to drive himself crazy, and he just had a giving up moment, and then he had his big awakening. Or Eckhart Tolle, he just was, I can't live with myself anymore. And then he had this thought of, are there two of me? Who is it that can't live with whom? And then he went to bed, and next thing you know, boom, he's, or even like Thomas Edison, he would work and work and work and work on a problem, and then he'd take a nap, and then maybe waking up from his nap, he would have the insight. There's so many examples of that.
So many examples, and I think that just like it's so great, I mean, it's not fun when it happens, but I really feel like it's precisely because the mind has to kind of exhaust itself, so the intellect just kind of gives up, and then the stuff kind of emerges. But yeah, I mean, it was a completely, I think for me, this was massive because I knew that if I could see this, everybody else can, and to me, this was such a great news. So obviously I went into like wanting to let everyone know that they are not their thoughts, and they're just caught up in their stories in their head. And if only you don't buy into whatever goes on in your head, you'll be fine. So I went into this like really annoying mode, which I can't even imagine how annoying that must have been for many people, of like almost like the born again kind of syndrome or something, which is also now when I look at it, it's kind of, it was very innocent, but like I said, I also understand how annoying that must have been to be at the receiving end of this.
We've all been through phases like that. I cringe sometimes thinking of things I said or did.
It's really, really annoying. But yeah, equally innocent, and it really at that point, it really the enthusiasm for sharing this really came purely out of not look at me, look what I found. At that point, it was more like, look what I found. You need to know this. You need to know this because there is so much freedom.
Yeah, you see people going through unnecessary suffering because they don't know this, and you want to out of compassion, you want to help them.
Yes,
but that can be a fundamentalist trip also.
It can totally become a fundamentalist trip, but and also, like I said, annoying to be at the receiving end of this.
Yeah, I mean, think of all the fundamentalist Christians in the world who look at everybody and
Oh,
think they're
yeah,
going to
yeah,
hell, and I'm
yeah,
not. I better help them not go to hell. You
yeah.
know?
A fundamentalist version of anything
Right.
is just awful.
Yeah. Pain in the
But for
ass.
me, yeah, total pain in the ass. But at that point, I remember there was quite a period of time where it was really genuinely out of just compassion. Like, you need to know
Yeah.
this. Like, I don't want you to suffer. Look, I'll tell you this, and things will change, and so on. So, um, it was, yeah. I mean, to be, I will probably always say that for as long as anyone hears is willing to hear me, that if that was the only insight that I've ever had, if I haven't had any other insight after that, that would have been plenty, because I really felt like it sort of saved my life in many ways, as well,
Hmm.
and just completely shifted, um not just how I saw other people, because, by the way, again, the beauty of that insight was that it translated onto everyone else, in that I saw the inherent innocence of all people, right? I saw how people are caught up in their stories and beliefs and thoughts, all of them, not just me, right? So that if I that inherent peace with capital P was available to everyone, that everyone was sort of inherently whole, and that was so beautiful about that, um And I think the other thing I would say, the most liberating thing, was that I just didn't have to believe anything I thought about myself, because right up till that point, everything I thought about myself just felt very, like, solid and sort of definite, whereas that completely blew everything sort of, nothing looked fixed and solid anymore. Basically, everything was up for questioning from that
Yeah.
point
That's
onwards.
that's
Yeah.
always a good attitude, I think. You know,
Yeah.
at every in life in general, and at every stage of the spiritual path, don't be so damn sure about anything. Always be open to questioning your assumptions, and questioning what teachers say. I mean, you don't have to be a total skeptic or cynic,
Uh,
because that would take it to the other extreme. Just questioning everything, meaning it's all BS, and I'm not going to accept any of it. But
yeah.
there's a kind of a balancing point between credibility and open-mindedness. I think you referred to open-mindedness earlier in this conversation.
Yeah, totally. Just curiosity, and
Yeah,
um
curiosity.
curiosity, and not necessarily looking for some kind of definite conclusion on any subject, but just to
Hmm.
stay. But that is not to say, Rick, I still, years later, discovered that I was so close-minded about so many things. I had so many other ideas that I was kind of holding on to rigidly, without being aware that I was doing it. But that came later on. So it didn't cure me, like it didn't cure me
Well, it's a
from,
progressive
yeah,
on development. It's not,
yeah, yeah.
it doesn't happen overnight.
No, no, not at all. But it was, but like I said, just to know, just to feel and know that I was not inherently broken, that I didn't really need fixing, that there was nothing really inherently wrong with me. That doesn't mean that couldn't be things to be improved, or be better at, but I'm talking inherently broken, that was massively impactful. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Now, I got the impression from your book that with this shift that happened in Phoenix,
Mm-hmm.
everything was pretty groovy for a while, smooth and peaceful, and so on. But
Yeah.
then things started to bubble up or loosen up, and you had to start facing, um, some difficult emotions and confusion and fear and angst and so on.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. So again, it was very gradual process, because you were talking about people awakening without practice, or things like that. I really didn't know that this was called an awakening. To me, it
Right.
was just like I said, a fundamental shift in perception that if it happened to me, it could happen to anyone. So I didn't see it as a spiritual event or something that happened to spiritual people. And it didn't put me on any kind of spiritual path. I was just continuing with my life. It's just that I just experienced life differently, basically. Um, and I would say that for the next 2-3 years, I was in just this like equanimity. Like,
Mm.
I think that's probably the best word. So life was not. It's not. Life was. In fact, the first year after the shift, life was very challenging on
Mm.
many fronts. But I was just experiencing it and navigating it very differently, with much more grace, with much more ease. And then basically, yeah, some 3 years into, and by the way, because that equanimity lasted for so long, I kind of assumed this is how I'm gonna always be. You see? That this is how it's like, and I'm not talking that I was like always blissful or always happy. No, not like that, but there was a certain that peace with capital P, let's put it this way, that was always there regardless, and there was very little that could actually throw me in any way. And then after about 3 years, it was kind of a gradual process where I started suffering again, And then when I say again, I was suffering more than I suffered even before that shift, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And this time it was even more scary. It was kind of scary because I had no idea why this was going on. I just found myself so completely and utterly depressed, and I'm talking like serious, like not wanting to get out of bed, you know, um, not wanting to get on with life, suicidal thoughts, um, which by the way, I have to mention that that's another reason why I say that this first shift, if that's the only thing that happened, it would have been plenty, because I have no doubt that because of that insight, that first insight, um, I actually didn't follow through, with that. Basically, I just knew that those were just thoughts and that it was going, there was a knowing that whatever I was going through was eventually going to pass.
Was there anything in your external circumstances, such as relationship or job or anything else, that could have caused all this depression, or was it
Nope.
purely a subjective thing?
It was that's why it was so completely confusing, because there was nothing that I could point to as the reason why I was suffering so much, So this is why it was just, I didn't know Angelo, I didn't know, you know, Suzanne Marie, I didn't know people like that, where if I shared with them my experience or what happened, they'd be like, oh, here's where you're at, here's your next step, or here's what you should do, or something like that. I had no frame of reference. Again, still not a spiritual seeker, still not doing anything in this area. So I was very, very lost and very, very confused. There were periods of like just sheer terror, sheer terror that was just coming out of nowhere. And again, for no apparent reason, and so that went on and off for nearly 10, well, if I count from 3 years of like equanimity, maybe 7 years, on and off.
I have a theory about this. Let me see what you think of it.
Tell me.
And that is that, a shift can take place, a big shift, and it acts as a kind of solvent for buried stuff that otherwise would just stay buried. But once you have the shift, then there's a kind of it has a dissolving influence, and stuff starts to loosen up, which otherwise might not have. And this is why we hear this term "dark night of the soul," or various difficult phases people go through after having had a beautiful awakening. It's just kind of like opens the Pandora's box so all the little demons can get out.
Yeah. Big time. No, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Now I know that. Now I
Yeah.
know that. Now I know exactly, precisely this is what was happening. It does open a Pandora box. It actually, um, I would even say that every shift, because there's several, at least there've been several in my experience, kind of illuminates more and more stuff,
Yeah.
and so this is basically a lot of sort of unconscious material was coming up to the surface,
Hmm.
and wanted to be met, but I didn't know that. So what I was doing, I was basically I was dismissing everything as just a thought or just an illusion. You see what I mean? So every
So for
time,
like 7 years, you were dealing with
yeah,
this stuff and dismissing
I
it
was
as just
dealing with it
thoughts?
for 7 years on and off. It wasn't like that. I was out of that quote unquote peace with capital P, for lack of a better
Right.
word. I was out of it. Torture, dark night, depression, whatever, back to it again. So it was in and out, in and out, you know? Um, I never went back to seeing life the same way as before the shift. So the shift was permanent. There was no way I could see things the same way as before the shift, but now I was suffering, and telling myself it was all just a thought and illusion just wasn't cutting it. And it just
Yeah.
and
It's like holding your hand in a flame and saying, "Oh, it's just a thought," It's not going to help.
exactly that. And so it became my actual coping mechanism. So now, and this is
Hmm.
actually very common, when a particular shift becomes like a hiding place or like a coping mechanism, and it's a way to basically dismiss or bypass or just basically stay in denial. And I didn't know that I was doing that. So this is why I have no judgment about this, because it's innocent. Like, I really didn't know any better, I just um I was just at the mercy of what was going on without any clue why this was happening. And so now I know in retrospect that I was basically just suppressing and suppressing, um until basically I couldn't anymore.
Is this the phase that you refer to as the darkest night, or was that something that
No,
happened even
no,
after that?
that's
That's later.
yeah.
Oh, the
So
best is yet to
yeah,
come. So,
yeah.
so how did you get out of this 7-year phase?
So, so basically, I would say that those were like multiple dark nights. Multiple
Right.
dark nights
Wave
on and
in
off. Yeah,
waves, wave after wave. Yeah.
in waves, wave after wave after wave, and then basically, well, now when I look back, I think that just again something exhausted itself,
Hmm.
and there was basically something was in the process of exhausting itself basically over all those years. And then there was a situation which seemed to have basically pushed me over the edge, so to speak. And I experienced like just a massive emotional breakdown, which I now call the surrender.
Mm-hmm.
And that threw me into what I call the darkest night.
So it got even darker than your 7 years. Yeah, and you say in your book that you started to be flooded with memories and blame and
Yeah.
and judgment
Yeah.
and so on. It just started pouring out. Martin, your traits you didn't like about yourself, such as manipulativeness or narcissism or
Yeah.
lying or
All the
all that
nice
kind of stuff.
things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, first of all, it was, it felt like a cork popped. It was almost as if, I was stuff tried to come out over those 7 years, but, I would just like cork it up, and then the cork basically popped, and it was like an avalanche of things that basically come out. But at the same time, I also look at it as like a moment of a surrender, in that I felt that all my attempts to mitigate my experience, to do something, including dismissing it as just an illusion or just a thought, just collapsed. And I was feeling emotions so fully for the first time that actually even though it was incredibly painful, it was also incredibly liberating, because I just could not bypass or suppress anymore. It just, my body, it was kind of as if my body just said, enough is enough. It's that's it, you know? And there was a palpable momentum that picked up that day. That it felt like I was in the process now of something that was running this process that had nothing to do with me already then. And then I went into this, like a really, really, I call it the darkest night, because all that subconscious, unconscious material was coming up to the surface. Lots of trauma, lots of memories, lots of grievances, that kind of stuff. But also, for the first time, I was discovering things about myself that I didn't see before, like I consider myself as this like noble person, better than, morally superior, blah, 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 from certain someone specifically, and then in comparison to other people. And basically, the best way I can describe it was just like, one by one, every time I pointed a finger at someone to accuse them of something, and feeling noble and righteous as I was doing it, the finger would turn around and started, like, it was like sitting in a cinema, and there would be like memories of me doing something similar to another person, maybe, or in different circumstances, maybe not as in, maybe not at the same thing, maybe not as huge or overt or something like that, but nevertheless,
there's a saying, if you point your finger at someone, there's 3 fingers pointing back at you. These ones.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if one is willing to see that. But it was extraordinary, Rick, because I genuinely didn't know how many stories I had of myself that just were not true. And I'm talking from like the simplest things, like, I would never lie. I could never lie, or something. And then I had like multiple examples coming in my memory of like, situations where I lied to someone or told half truths or some white lies or something. We're talking everything, like how I would pride myself in being non-judgmental, and then seeing how I judge people all the time, and like actually really harshly, and so on, right down to like really narcissistic tendencies, like kind of manipulations of all sorts in relationships. But again, this stuff was not conscious. It was like the unconscious became conscious. It's like someone turned the lights on, and now, I could just see my whole self. And when I say my whole self, with all the good and the really bad, quote unquote, and there was no hiding from it, which is why it really felt like I was just burning in shame for like months, and that whole image of this noble me was just like burning to the ground, like piece by piece, that genuinely by the end of this process, I couldn't see the other. I could not point at someone and not see myself immediately as them. So there was no anything left of me feeling better, more noble than anyone else, was just like gone. And that was really very painful, very painful.
I wish everyone could go through this before spiritual awakening, because what often happens is people have some profound spiritual awakening, and maybe they even become a famous guru or something, supposedly very enlightened person, and yet they have huge amounts of narcissism and dishonesty and all kinds of shortcomings, personality shortcomings that they appear to be blind to, because they haven't worked them out. And these things often even become more magnified, perhaps, because of their spiritual awakening. So the way in which the order in which you've done things seems very healthy to me.
Yeah, I'm so grateful. I mean, to be honest with you, it was one of the most soul destroying experiences. It was it was a horrible experience. It was, totally, you could say, ego crushing, on all levels. It's just absolutely nothing like left of it. It's just like, I really describe it as like life brought me down to my knees. Like, it was intent to bring me down to my knees, and it succeeded, and I'm so grateful for it. I'm so grateful for it. And you are right. It's just that, like I said, I think, uh, I'm absolutely not. I totally agree with what you've just said, and I'm absolutely not excusing anybody. But it was extraordinary to realize how much of what I saw in myself was completely unconscious. Like, I was just not aware of so many of those things. I think the trouble is when someone points it out to you and you're still not willing to see it as a teacher. You see what I mean? So, like, that's, or there may be even instances where there will be teachers who will be teaching about shadow work, not doing never having done shadow work themselves, and things like that.
And also there are teachers who isolate themselves from critical feedback, who don't want to hear it, and if somebody offers it, that person gets kicked out or silenced.
Yeah, red flag, big time.
Yeah.
And so, exactly, and it's like, yeah, it's a massive topic, and it's a really important one, and you are right. I think there are many people who don't get to do this bit, because honestly, who would want this? Nobody would want this. I yeah, part of me doesn't wish this on anyone to go through something like this, because it's humiliating, but it's extremely humbling, and it's a really good thing ultimately. And yes, you definitely, you'd wish that the people who are especially in spiritual realms, who teach big numbers of people, that they've done it. But
yeah, I mean, I don't know about the profession of psychiatry or psychology, but presumably if a person pursues that profession, they have to do a lot of self-scrutiny as part of their training, because they have to go through therapy themselves and everything. And that might be a good prerequisite for becoming a spiritual teacher.
It would be a great prerequisite. But unfortunately, this is also where the trap is that at some point, and I've lived that trap myself, because in those 7 years, if you mentioned to me therapy, in those moments when I struggled, right? If you mentioned to me, maybe you could, see therapist, or maybe you could, talk to someone or whatever, I would say, absolutely forget about it. I am not going to go to therapist, because all they do is just, it's like I'm working on stories, on illusion. Why would I talk about my past? My past doesn't exist. Why would I talk about my traumas? Traumas don't exist. It's just a story. You see? So, and again, I wasn't
Were you reading a bunch of books or watching a bunch of YouTube videos that were drilling that notion into your head? Because there are a lot of people who talk that way.
No,
don't worry about Gaza. It's just a story,
Yeah, no, this was, and interesting. So imagine, I was not even, this attitude came out of that first shift, because I saw how so much is just created, it's in the mind, blah, blah, blah. Right. And, it's, yeah. And especially like dwelling in the past and going and dwelling on your story of your childhood, which is an illusion as well. And it's like, and I kind of laugh about it now. And I wasn't even like radical neo-Advaita, whatever. Like, this just came out from that first shift. But I genuinely saw it that way. It wasn't that this was my genuine outlook, at that point. So I wouldn't even consider things like therapy, because to me it was just being lost in the story, and ultimately an illusion. And so I see it all the time now, and what you're talking about is that, and sometimes the more profound the insight, sometimes I just talked to someone about hiding in emptiness. There are people that can be totally stuck in this kind of where a profound shift, any profound shift, doesn't matter if it's no-doer, emptiness, nothingness, I don't care, can be literally hijacked by the mind and use it as a kind of a hiding place, as a way to bypass, as a way to stay in denial. And very often you might not even know that you're doing it. And I would say it's mostly the case that you don't even know that you're doing it, because you're looking from a completely different perspective until hopefully someone either points it out to you or something happens that shifts you farther. But it's definitely one of the big traps where what once is a genuinely profound insight becomes a kind of excuse or a reason not to look at the human aspect of our being, which we all share, no matter how awake anyone is. I don't care.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Are you aware of or are you a member of the Association for Spiritual Integrity? You know about that?
I know about it from Buddha the gas pump, but
Right, yeah.
I haven't investigated it, and I'm not a member. Because I thought this is
just
for
curious.
teachers. I thought it was for teachers.
Yeah, mainly, but you kind of fit the definition.
Oh no!
I mean,
Gosh.
we have actual astrologers in there, who are providing that
Oh.
kind of service,
Oh,
and they're
okay.
members. But a lot of the things we're discussing here are things that organization, which I helped to establish,
Yes, I
concerns
know. Yeah.
itself with greatly in
Yeah.
order to help to clean up some of these things in the spiritual community that have been very harmful to people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, that's just a side note.
I'm glad that I'm glad that it exists. I'm glad the organization exists. Yeah.
Check it out. So how did you work through this phase, this darkest night phase? Presuming you have. I think you have.
How did I work? I survived, basically. I survived. No, something profound started happening as a result of that. Like I said, there was a certain momentum. And it lasted for a few months, and then gosh, let me try to. I bet I'm gonna miss bits and pieces, so I'm just giving you the gist of what happened next. Yes, at some point I started looking for like videos about awakening. For which I didn't even understand why I was doing it, because I had no interest in awakening. I had no interest in spirituality. But I somehow felt drawn to listening to like people talking about awakening. And now I know that I was basically I wasn't so much looking for awakening or anything. I was trying to understand why, after such a profound shift, I was suffering so much. Like, I really was looking for someone on YouTube that could explain to me why this was happening. And this is probably when I came across a video of someone that actually was guest on your channel.
Bonnie Greenwell?
Not Bonnie Greenwell. It was Shakti.
Katarina Maggi.
Yes. It was her. Okay, so I listened to her. So basically, one of the things that I talk about a book that, I would come across certain teachers and I was just looking for humanity. I was like, okay, I heard about transcendence. Okay, moving on. Like, still explain I've had an insight. I've seen what you're talking about. Why am I, I had at this point, Rick, I still didn't know that there were stages of awakening. I still didn't know that there was awakening of the heart or God or what that even meant, none of it. I actually didn't know it for I've really just only started learning about all this stuff kind of afterwards. And anyway, so she was the first teacher. I will never forget when I found her talk. And she talked about post-awakening journey. And she started bringing up these issues of all sorts, like mental health issues, psychological issues, physical, I don't remember which talk it was, but my jaw was on the floor and I was just like, my heart was racing and I was like, oh my God, finally a spiritual teacher who talks about this whole other side of this process that no one else, at least I'm sure more people talked about it, but I couldn't find anyone until I found her who mentioned this stuff. And all of a sudden, first of all, I saw a teacher who also appeared to be human to me, who I could kind of relate to, which I very much appreciated, you know and spoke also in a way that I could relate to, didn't use too much of like terminology that I could understand or something. So so that was incredible just to hear that. And then there was a moment where things have kind of calmed down on their own, like the darkest night, lasted and lasted. Things started sort of calming down. And then one day I was on my own at home and I was watching something on Netflix, and I felt this like wave of terror coming over me, like one of those that used to happen years earlier. And I was really surprised and completely taken by it because I was like, oh, okay, here we go again. Like I thought that was kind of, past me. But at this point, and it is important that because of the darkest night and because I felt like I was forced to be with the discomfort, emotional discomfort, physical discomfort, all kinds of discomfort, my body built the capacity to be with basically discomfort of any kind, and this is actually extremely important. And even before that, I will say, Rick, that to me, that darkest night, I can't imagine this process of awakening without it. And actually, to me, it's as important as any profound shift. As important, not less, not more. It's as important as any other shift.
So are you saying everyone has to go through one?
I don't know that everyone has to go through one. I think that everyone goes through their version of it. For some people, it's going to be very intense. For some people, it will be less intense. We're all different. So I really don't, I don't like to generalize because I really just don't know. And I also don't know if anyone has to go through it. I'm just saying that in my experience, I honestly, looking back, can't imagine. I can't imagine embodied awakening without descending to hell for a while.
Yeah.
I really just without having gone through that darkest night and facing the not so pleasant bits about myself, and facing shame and facing guilt and facing all kinds of fears, I really can't imagine that because it's how I discovered a lot of unconscious coping mechanisms, a lot of unconscious patterns. And had I not become aware of that, they would continue to play out, you see, no matter how profound other shifts may have been.
I see what you mean. And I think what we were saying earlier is that perhaps in some cases people manage to bypass that without resolving all that stuff and achieve some kind of high state. But there's all this unresolved stuff that ends up causing their behavior to be very distorted in certain ways.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly.
And perhaps ends up in a big crash and burn event eventually.
Yeah. I mean, you can only, exactly. Because I mean, I don't even know how the body can sustain this kind of level of denial, because the body keeps the score genuinely. And sooner or later, I feel like you'll be forced one way or another to deal with stuff that just wants to naturally come up. But again, I really can't speak for other people, and I really don't know how that plays out for everyone. But I'm just saying that for me, and I can't underline it, that the transcendental, so quote unquote, shifts were absolutely important, but that part was equally important. And I, as painful as it was to go through it, I really just can't imagine um, that
Yeah.
process without it.
Yeah, I agree. It's a big house cleaning that everyone needs to go through, and I suppose the
Yep.
intensity and duration of it depends upon
Yes,
how messy your house is. But
totally.
we all have some cleaning up to do.
And it's what I came to see now that I'm, a few years since the last shift, is that it's layers. The way
Yeah,
I see it anyway, for as long as I'm in this human body, there is no end point to this, because I've already
yeah,
seen basically, and I would even say that it's a kind of indication of awakening where you actually no longer look for an endpoint, in a sense. It's
yeah.
like, or imagining that there is such thing. Um,
I'm like a broken record on that point. And you may have heard my favorite quote from Saint Teresa of Avila, which is, "It appears that God Himself is on the journey."
Yes, amazing. I love it. Yeah, I love it so much. Well, for me, this body, it's a whole other story, which maybe you remember from the book, but because obviously there are other shifts that happened, but the awakening of the end of separation, the emptiness, the awakening of the heart, the awakening of the gut, which were incredibly pivotal. But after all those shifts, I only got to discover the layers of stuff, in the body, that this body holds, that I cannot even access anymore, um sort of consciously. It's just extraordinary. So
Yeah.
so looking for some kind of an endpoint, or a point at which I'll be free from all my infliction or all my human, I don't know, screw ups or whatever, is just, yeah, I can't relate to that at all. So
Yeah, this is why I don't like Neo Advaita. I mean, because they say things like you're already enlightened and all this stuff about, and about progress and
mhm.
layers, and it's all
Mhm.
just a lot of mind stuff. It's all illusion, and you're just indulging in it, and you're keeping yourself endlessly on a hamster wheel of chasing after something, blah 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 blah. But I really think
Yeah,
everything you're saying is very valid here.
and it's not even that, because a lot of what they're saying is not even that it's not true, you see.
Right.
It's just that.
That's one dimension of it, but it's not the whole enchilada.
And also, this is where um it's like, the way I see it is that the mind hijacks a profound shift and turns it into a view, you see.
Right,
Turns it
right.
into a specific fixed view from which it speaks, from which it views everything, and it's kind of one-sided, and so right there, to me, that's already suspicious. So yeah.
Hmm.
Middle way, Rick, I think, is really always a good idea.
And it's not a helpful teaching for a lot of people because they hear people talking this way and then they try to adopt that attitude, which is an attitude you said you had for a while.
Yep.
And they kind of deny a lot of things and
Yeah.
even begin to become, nihilistic or lose interest in their family, things like that, because they're just dismissing and denying so much of the lived human reality.
But that's precisely the difference between an actual insight and when mind co-opts an insight or a certain
Right.
understanding and then uses it. It's the same thing with anything, like, using non-doer, when the non-doership, if it's not directly experienced, the mind will co-opt the uses to excuse inexcusable behaviors. It's the same thing, and you can just tell, because no one who's had a direct experience of non-doership will ever say such thing. And in fact, you'd say that, like, not only that it's not true, I would say it's precisely the opposite, because the sense of self that would try to hide and avoid and pretend and kind of gloss over things kind of dissolves, and there's no hiding place. Your behaviors, your inflictions, everything is out in the open. And to me, if I can say one thing about the way I see the realization, is that accountability and responsibility is inherent with it. It's absolutely inherent with it. So if anyone uses and co-opts any spiritual concept as a way to excuse inexcusable behaviors or something, then that's like red flag, as far as I'm concerned.
No, very well put. And you saved me from having to go on one of my rants about that very point.
I did the rant for you, Rick. Oh my God, people will be
Thank
exhausted.
I've ranted on that too many times. So I don't want to skip too far ahead without going through the intermediate steps. But you talk about falling into isness, I think is the way you put it.
Stumbling on the isness.
And there are various stages of emptiness, nothingness, isness.
Yes.
Are we jumping ahead too far if we start talking about that? You want to cover some other stuff first, or go right into it?
I can just maybe do quick, so not to exhaust your audience completely.
They've got a lot of stamina, my audience.
That's true. I can run through some. So after that darkest night, what followed was what we can refer to as the dissolution of a sense of separation, and what I call like falling sort of into an emptiness, which was actually a very scary experience at first, because like I said, one night there was this like wave of terror that came out of nowhere, and this time I was not as terrified of it, like, again, the darkest night helped me build the capacity to be with that kind of discomfort. And so instead of avoiding it or running away from it, I lay down on my bed and I kind of lean into it. And I got curious about the terror, and all I knew that it was a kind of a existential terror. It was like a terror of non-existence. That's the best way I can describe it. And I kind of started conversing with it. Like, what is this about? What do I fear? And I don't even know how that came about. I think I must have. Oh no, I know. I actually discovered Gangaji's website. Gangaji is one of my favorite teachers of all time, by the way. And I discovered her website, and there was like a little inquiry, completely free, like an inquiry, sets of questions that anyone can do for themselves. And I think that reading through them helped me do that inquiry for myself, even though it was not the same inquiry, but I kind of knew which direction to go because of that. So I just wanted to bring that up in case anyone wants to check it out. And it was like, okay, so what do you fear? And I was like, okay, that I'm not loved, that I'm not loved. And I kind of knew that it was not really that. And and so I continue, like, what do I fear about that? Well, that I'm not special, that I'm not special. And if I'm not special, then what do I fear about that? And the answer came that I'm nobody, you see? And so the moment that answer came through, it was as though I was sucked into this like black void of sorts, which at first it was like a black void. It really felt like death, to be honest with you. It felt kind of like that. But then very soon after, it's like the dark turned into like what I call emptiness, or empty fullness. It was the darkness was light, the fear was love. There was like no, the whole sense of separation between form and formless kind of disappeared. And with that, there was also like I had, I will have to rewind a little bit, but I had kind of a knot in my belly, in the solar plexus for many, many years. And I mentioned that a little bit in the book because it was actually quite a traumatic experience when someone pressed on it many, many years
Oh yeah,
ago.
you're having a massage kind of, or Thai
Yeah,
massage or some such
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
yeah. It was absolutely traumatizing that.
Yeah, and the guy barely touched it, and all of a sudden you were
Yeah,
freaking out.
yeah. I was freaking out. It was just that it was it was both kind of physical and emotional pain sort of intertwined at the same time.
Mm.
So we were both freaked out because I did not know why I reacted like that either, you know? So, so it was really quite interesting because that knot, as I was in this empty fullness or whatever, you know, that knot started dissolving. And by the time of it, it felt like the existential angst that was still there, even though I worked through the fears and I worked through so much stuff and all of that. There was still this underlying, what I would call, this is why I call it a knot of separation, you know, because it felt like it was a knot. It was a kind of physical knot that contained almost like the core of this existential angst that is because of the sense of separation. So when that sense of separation dissolved, that knot dissolved with it. And it really felt like even my physical body kind of dissolved into that emptiness with it. And even the body was not separate anymore from, you know, the formless or whatever. So, but if you had asked me after that, you know, I kind of got up and I was like, wow, that was something else. And I just went and made myself a cup of tea and went on with whatever I was doing. Because I still didn't have a frame of reference. I would have never told you, oh, this was emptiness and this was a sense of separation dissolved and this was an awakening of the heart and God. I didn't know that. I was in the moment. I didn't know that this is what it was. It kind of became clear afterwards. And
Yeah.
after that,
This is one thing I find fascinating about
yeah.
you is you can read some little line on a website or something and it precipitates this whole dramatic, profound shift. That kind of stuff doesn't happen to me. You know, I mean, I kind of crank away with my spiritual practice and all.
Yeah.
But I kind of get the feeling, and this might seem like philosophical speculation, but I think you're one of these people who perhaps has done a lot of spiritual practice in past lives. I believe in past lives. And so you come into this life and there's this kind of realization that you're destined to achieve, and you're led to, you know, things that this thing and that thing that serve not as necessarily causes of the level of realization that you are destined to achieve, but rather just as little catalysts that kind of make it happen. But it's got the momentum to happen anyway. But some little line on a website triggers a big shift and kind of moves you more fully into your natural birthright that you're destined to realize. Does that ring true to you?
I mean, I definitely heard someone mention that. I don't remember who that was. And it's possibly true. You know, I really just can't know that. But it's certainly plausible. It sounds plausible, you know, because like I said,
because 1,000 other people could read that line on that website and not get anything. You know, and you read it, and the next thing you know, you're in unity consciousness or something.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah, but you know, it was like it's been relentless. It's been really, and I think that, you know, as much as this is absolutely true, everything you're saying, at the same time, it's been really tough ride. Like, I mean, it's been
Yeah.
It's been really, really tough ride, and I think that this is part of the awakening process that is still, I believe, very rarely talked about, because this was by no means over, actually, because right after that, well, soon after that, I had next batch of stuff come up to the surface, like
Yeah.
traumas and wounds and all sorts of things coming up to the surface. And that's where the energy started kicking in, which,
Oh yeah, you had all the Kundalini symptoms and things.
all the Kundalini symptoms, I had, it started with the shaking, kind of randomly, like involuntary movements, these kinds of stuff. But again, even then, like I did normal, there was something, because I'm such an inquisitive person, and I normally will like Google things and check things and research things to death, and stuff like that. There was no urgency to do that, funnily enough, It was almost like there was a sense of this momentum that I mentioned. There was a momentum, there was something taking place that had almost like nothing to do with me. And there was like a palpable sense.
Well, that's what
I
was kind of saying a minute ago. You've got this momentum going in your life.
Yeah.
And it just is dragging you along, whether you want it or not, from one thing to the next.
Yeah. There is some disadvantages to that. Like, for example, this is probably why I never had a clue as to what I actually want to do with my life or where I'm actually going. Like, honestly, I've never had I was just kind of following some kind of crumbs or something, crumb trail or whatever, But even with those movements, I didn't know it was called Kundalini. I kind of trusted that there was like, I can't even call it trust. There was kind of a knowing that there was a process and it was a happening and it just had to basically play out. There was a moment of concern, I would say, with there was only one moment where I thought maybe I was developing Tourette's or something like that, to be honest, because
you were pushing Kundalini stuff.
And I'm serious about that, because it was kind of like a bit much at some point. Then the only thing that I started noticing is like if someone spoke truth, like heartfelt truth, for example, near me, the movements would start. Or if I heard the word consciousness or something, then my body would react, So there were certain predictable kind of patterns that I started noticing, like when those movements were kicking in, but otherwise they were kind of random. But then I started having these like real surges of energy, and those were really, really unsettling, at least at the beginning. Where literally where I'm sitting, I felt like I had to like hold on to my sofa, because I felt like if I didn't, it would I don't know, I would explode or something would happen. I know it sounds very dramatic, but like honestly, it felt this dramatic. This was genuinely a point at which I believed that levitation exists. Like I really believe that maybe if I weigh half of what I weigh, that energy had the capacity to actually lift me off the ground, like genuinely. And so that went on for a while, and I noticed very quickly that the more I would lean into it rather than try to resist it or like get freaked out by it, then that energy would kind of settle on its own and much quicker. And then there was like again, I'm kind of rushing through a little bit. So I'm going through another kind of batch of stuff in terms of like my past traumas and things. The energy surges are happening and so on. And then one night I am in my bedroom. I'm listening to the Conscious TV. I don't know if Conscious TV still exists.
Ian and Renata McNay.
Yes, Ian and Renata McNay. And I would sometimes, because I loved Renata's voice because it was so soothing. And so I would put one of her conversations with someone on, and I would kind of go in and out of sleep. And normally I would fall asleep and then listen to the rest on the next day. And I was kind of drifting in and out of sleep. I don't even remember what video that was or who was talking. And at some point, and I was laying on my back, and at some point, this guest says the word consciousness, and my body starts to vibrate. The whole body started to vibrate. The whole room started vibrating. And I could feel that surge of energy, basically like a buildup. And to the point, I mean, this is gonna sound so like crazy, but like my head was started to move from side to side, like really rapidly, you know? And it freaked me out for a moment because this was like a new movement that didn't happen before. And then I just remembered that I have to relax into it, that I just have to relax into it. And as soon as I relaxed into it, and this is literally the best way I can describe it, as crazy as it sounds, like everything disappeared, you know? And I just kind of, there was a void, which was different to the emptiness, the one before emptiness, which is why I make a distinction between emptiness and nothingness. And there was just this seeing of this like bubble floating. There was a bubble floating in a space. It was like I would call it now like a primordial void or something like that. And there was a bubble floating in it. Oh, come on. And I knew that that bubble was me and my life. That the bubble was my life, and the me was in it. Hello. Hi. Sorry, so cute. I couldn't have to at least acknowledge and say, "Oh, so cute."
This
oh my
is
god.
Theo. Theo the dog.
Oh god.
Hey Theo. You're famous now.
Hi Theo. Yeah. Hi. Look at you.
He really wanted to get on my lap. So.
Oh, I can tell he was desperate for cuddles.
Yeah.
So yeah, so basically there was a recognition that this bubble was my life, and that I was in it. And then the moment that recognition happened, the bubble burst, and then there was just nothing. And wow. I must have fallen asleep, clearly, because I woke up on the next day, and I'm sitting on the bed, and my partner comes in, and I go, "There's nobody here." But I don't know. And I said, and I'm disoriented, but I don't know who's disoriented. So it doesn't make any sense. Like I was totally aware that what I was saying didn't make any sense, you know? And he looked at me and he said that I looked like a deer, you know, like caught in lights and
deer in the headlights. Yeah.
In the headlights. Yeah. And because, yeah, I just felt something was gone. Like the sense of I that was there the day before, that was kind of in charge, let's call it the doer, whatever, you know, was there, and now it wasn't, you know? So it literally felt like my body was hollow. It was actually a very visceral experience. I wouldn't call it a state or a kind of anything transcendental, because I was sitting there on the bed with my body and everything normally talking. It was just, there was a sense of something gone very much. Something was very gone. And then I would get up, you know, and started cleaning like I do. I just get on with things, you know. So I started tidying the apartment and everything, and everything felt like miraculous activity. I was staring at the bottle of window spray, and like it was looking at me like I mean, it's hard to describe, but literally everything, and the whole, I was, you know, it was like the body was moving and cleaning and doing all the activities in an incredibly focused way. Like that window spray and that cloth were like the only things that existed in the universe in that moment. It was just like absolutely unbelievable. And it was so clear that there was no sense of doer needed for things to be done. Like the digesting happens, like breathing happens, is the same with everything else. And so that was it. And you know, I had few days of disorientation, a bit of disorientation because of that. But then it kind of quickly kind of, I don't know, integrated itself or settled down. I don't know how to say it. So much so that I never talked about it since. Like I wouldn't talk to anyone about it because it was just, there's nothing to talk about, you know. It's Again, if you had asked me at the time, I would never say to you anything about no-doer. I would never talk about consciousness. I would never talk about any of those things. I would just describe the bubble, describe the nothing, describe the hollowness, and that would be it, because I didn't really have the language. I did hear those terms. I did hear terms like nothingness and emptiness floating around somewhere, listening to videos before, but I never made a connection, until long after. So actually my first conversation with Angelo, I still didn't connect the dots. Honestly, Rick, I was all over the place. I could only tell bits and pieces about my experience, but I really couldn't I still didn't make any sense out of what happened fully, and how those various shifts fit with the frame of reference that's used, in different traditions and stuff like that. And then I was walking in the woods, which is why I said we have it in common. We like to walk in the woods. And something else happened, which is really, this one is impossible to really describe because it was so, or it was such an ordinary moment of what I call the stumbling on isness, where basically there was just a recognition that there's just this, that this moment cannot be any different than what it is, kind of. I mean, it kind of sounds very kind of maybe lame as I said it, because, I've said those words, it is what it is, so many times, but they completely meant something very different, usually resignation. But it was a profound something, that happened. And as I walked back home, I saw what I call a mechanism of resistance, but some people would call it like a self structure. And I saw the sense of self as like this one massive coping mechanism, and that is like resisting what is, basically, and that it creates so much suffering. So it wasn't just the sense of separation that creates suffering, but the resistance to what is. And as soon as that mechanism was seen, and I'm talking like with such detail, right down to like molecular level, like it was almost like seeing this sense of self like an X-ray view, and all the different ways we resist unknowingly what is. And as soon as this structure was seen, it sort of collapsed. That's the best way I can describe it. And then this whole idea of awakening and stages kind of collapsed with it. Not like as like I'm not denying the stage or anything like that, because it can be easy kind of misconstrued. It's just that all of a sudden, even the whole idea of awakening kind of went, and the stages, and there was just this, and there was just like, what's left is just being human and doing human things, and it's like kind of like something happened and nothing happened. It was kind of like that, and where I genuinely, believe it or not, Rick, I actually ran out of words. Where I would not be able to. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? I told you that once I start, it's like once I'm off, I'm off. It's hard to shut me up. But
well, you're saying good stuff. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I do have a couple of questions.
Yeah, tell me.
Yeah. So earlier, maybe 20 minutes ago, we were talking about, you were saying that there appears to be no end to the journey. There's always going to be some new unfolding or something. Mm-hmm. And yet just now you were talking about the end of stages. So before I ask a second question, how about trying to reconcile those two statements?
Yeah. So it's not, it's kind of, which is why in the book I talk about, it was also the end of paradox, because all of a sudden the seeming opposites or contradictions, they coexist without conflict, right? So, which is why I can say the stages totally exist. I've been through stages, this is what they're called, and this is what happened, and this is what happened. And at the same time, see that none of that happened. and there's no conflict in that, you see?
Right.
So there's no rejecting of anything, there's no denying anything, none of that. If this is like the best shot in terms of that. So like you see multiple contradictions that coexist without conflict. There's no need to reject anything, basically. There's no holding, there's no pushing, there's no holding on to anything, there's no pushing anything away. Yeah.
Yeah. A couple of people have sent me t-shirts with the word paradox on them because I like the word so much, and I've used it so many times in these interviews. Yeah.
This is what, I mean, I call it a death of paradox, because all of a sudden the things that my mind would, because the mind, this is also what I saw that day, that the mind loves to see things in black and white terms. It has to be either like this or it has to be either like that, right? Whereas what happened there, it was like, it's like this, it's like that, and neither is true. And then there's something else, and then there's something else, and all of it coexists at the same time. There's no contradiction, which is why I called it a death of paradox. And I genuinely don't have anymore like an experience of paradox, because I see no conflict between all these seeming contradictions anymore.
I think the key word is conflict, because there's still paradoxical realities, just as there are in the universe itself. I mean, photons behave both as particles or as waves, depending upon whether or not somebody's observing them. But nature doesn't have a problem with that, And so there can be these paradoxical realities where nothing is happening and everything is happening, and you don't exist, yet you do exist, and on and on. We could name dozens of them.
Yeah, so exactly. Yet, so I suppose you're right that maybe the better word is that seeming contradictions basically coexist without conflict. That to me is like the best way to talk about it. The other thing I would say, and this is kind of difficult for me to convey, to be honest, because there was, that momentum that I talked about that picked up, especially during that emotional breakdown / surrender. That momentum picked up, and that day in the woods, there was palpable sense of that momentum coming to an end. You see?
Yeah.
But I would not call it an arrival point or an end point. You see? So this is why I have trouble. I don't know how else to talk about it other than that momentum came to an end. Maybe other way to say it is like the seeking came to an end, or looking for any other. There was no looking for anything else. There was no, the momentum came to an end. There was just this, you see? So, and that's it. But I don't see it as like, I don't know what else is out there. I can't talk about, I can't talk about, this is why I'm not comfortable talking about it as like an end point or an arrival point. I can only speak of the momentum definitely palpably sort of coming to an end, or like the search for my understanding. Because really for me this was not so much a journey of awakening, it was really a journey of seeking answers as to why I was suffering. And I felt like that was when that search came to an end, but then, as you know from the books, all sorts of other stuff started happening. So
there's another paradox that comes up a lot, and I've had long conversations with people like Susanna Marie and others about this, and that is the paradox of no self versus self, I guess you could call it. And you've talked a bit about no self, and my sense, and I don't claim to have the ultimate understanding of this. Maybe I'm at a spiritually immature stage or something. I don't know. But my sense is that it's a both-and situation. It's a paradoxical situation. And an analogy I use is like if you have a candle in a pitch dark room, it's really bright. It lights up the whole room. But if you put that same candle out in the bright sunlight, you can't even tell if it's lit or not because the sun is so bright. So I think that, and I've had discussions about this with some people, other people who claim to have been awakened for many, many years, who say that you never entirely lose a sense of personal self. It just kind of goes to the back seat. It's not for most people, that's their whole thing about who they are, but it becomes just more like a faculty, which is, not your primary sense of who you are, but it's something that enables you to function as a human being. And if it didn't, you could hit your thumb with a hammer and you wouldn't even know it, or someone would call your name and you wouldn't answer. There's some kind of localization in addition to the impersonal dimension that you might be primarily grounded in. So that's my understanding. And again, I don't insist that it's the right one. It's just the way I see it, for what it's worth.
Yeah. Well, this is I can confess straight away that this is the bit which I find impossible to convey, and that there's like literally no amount of explaining that I could do to convey what's actually in the direct experience. Very, very simple, and simple to the point of not being an issue at all, like whether there is a sense of self, where is it located? Is it here? Is it there? Is this what that means? Like, it's just not something that I even think about. So I really don't know where to go. I really wouldn't know where to go with this, because for me there was definitely first there was a sense of self as something completely separate, right? From the so-called formless, right? Or even that there was a separation between formless and form that then collapsed, and then not only that the sense of separation collapsed, but even distinction between the two, which is also impossible to really convey. I honestly wouldn't know how to convey this, but the difference is actually massive between the end of separation and the end of actual distinction between the two. So that would be one thing. Then there was, when that sense of separation was gone, then there was this experience of no-doer, which is to me kind of related to no self, where there is simply seeing that this body and mind is a kind of an intelligent mechanism that learns how to operate. And just like the breathing happens and all the processes in the body happen without any sense of me participating in it and controlling the process, so does everything else, right? And so this was another massive kind of very visceral, I wouldn't call it a transcendental state at all, funnily enough. It was a visceral sense of or loss of a sense of doership. And this is where I think, to me, the no doership is impossible to describe. It has to be experienced. Otherwise, it just makes no sense. No matter what words I at least I could put into. And this is why I said to you, I'm not very articulate when it comes to like the technicalities of explaining what's in the direct experience. Is very, very simple, but the no doership was really palpable. And which is why I shared that experience of, like, it was extraordinary to see how this body was totally intelligently moving throughout the day, doing the chores and cleaning and knowing exactly what to do without a sense of self that was in charge of that process. That's the only way I can describe it. But that didn't feel at all like some kind of disassociation. Doesn't mean that my brain was not switched on or anything like that, which is why it's so difficult to talk about it. So I would say there was this aspect of the self, no self, no doer kind of a thing. And then finally there was a sense of a whole kind of self structure collapsing. A self structure as just as a sort of a, and again, we're really talking metaphors here, because to me it was all about, and that is also a metaphor, a certain movement of the mind that came to an end, that was creating the illusion of a sense of separate someone. Okay. And that was really interesting, because I could see how, I call it like a horizontal movement of the mind. And in that moment in the woods, when I was coming back, I saw that mechanism, how that going back and forth between past and future, as though this was a linear time, was creating the illusion of a linear time. It was also creating this constant movement away or towards something else that was all constantly keeping the mind away from right here, and sort of movement that I call it like waging the war with what is, by either dwelling on the past or what ifing about a future, but never quite here. But it was all a movement. It was a mechanism. It was seen as a mechanism, as a movement of the mind. And when this movement and this same movement of the mind was creating an illusion of a separate someone in control. Okay. And then when that collapsed, it was as though the mind collapsed on itself. So the horizontal line collapsed and turned vertical. And the mind almost, I describe it as the mind rested in the perpetual now, which is not even a point in time. It's just that movement stopped. And then there was like what I call there was just this. And there really isn't, the best way I can describe is like there is no sense of self needed, in which is like, if you notice, I always point out to, like, I use the word sense all the time. That it's a sense. It's a there, in other words, there is no sense of self needed in order to function, or even sense of being a doer needed in order to function perfectly fine. So everything goes on exactly as it's always been. It's just that sense of personal doership, or a sense of self, in my experience, just isn't there, but also isn't a big deal. Like, it's not, I mean, it was a big deal for a moment, but it's kind of integrates, and it's just not needed in order to function, because the mind has developed, the brain has developed, it's learned, it knows what to do. And so it's like it's more like everything remains is just seen more like a happening, as opposed to someone doing something. And literally that is like my best shot in trying to go there. But this is why I don't I can't speak of, I in my experience, I can't relate to the positioning of that it goes to the background or foreground. There's none of that in the experience, or even a sense of self in the center, or some kind of groundless ground or something like that. Like, there's none of there's no sense of any of those things,
Okay. Well, as I say, I don't claim to have any kind of absolute understanding or experience of anything. Maybe a year from now, I would describe my experience exactly as you're describing it. But as it is now, it's more of a paradoxical thing where I totally get that there's no doer. There's clearly a sense of absolute silence in the midst of dynamic activity. And, I could be playing pickleball, which I haven't done for a few years, or tripping over something and hitting my face on the pickleball court, which happened one time. And as that happened, it wasn't happening to me. There was just that unshakable presence, isness. And
but everything, to me, everything, the whole full-blown human experience is exactly as it's always been.
yeah.
It's just what's not there is that sense of either personal doership or personal agency, but it doesn't mean no agency, which is why I'm saying that when it
So
comes
if it's not
to
personal agency, whose agency, or is it the body's agency or nature's agency?
it's like that question doesn't even arise, you see? Like that question, whose is it? Doesn't even arise. Like it's just a non-issue. But like this is why I think, this is one of the reasons why I don't even go to talking about this bit. Like pretty much like in my even like in my day to day, even in my one-on-one work with people, I very rarely go into this particular conversation because I can tell you that I remember when I listened to people talking about this prior to the realization, I had real I had real hard time wrapping my head around this, you know? And I've learned from my previous inquiries with starting with my first shift that there's just no point of trying to figure it out because I just wouldn't, because it's the only thing I say is that it's a non-issue. It's really it's a non-issue, and in the direct experience it's so completely obvious and simple, but I can totally see how the mind, at least my mind, had massive trouble wrapping itself around this whole idea. And the I just think that there are certain experiences that are possible to convey, or I'm just really bad at not being, or I'm simply one of those people that cannot convey to me this particular bit, which is impossible to describe. It just has to be experienced, and then it really is just a non-issue, you know?
Okay. Just for the record, and we'll never resolve this right now, but in Advaita Vedanta, the structure of the personality includes something called ahamkara, which means I maker. And it's said that you never lose that, just as you don't lose the intellect or the mind or the indriyas, the senses. It's a faculty. It's just a faculty. It's not who you are. But it's a faculty that makes living as a human being possible.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of a sense of self without it being the self, because the self
just
with
like
a capital
functioning,
S. Like function. Good. Okay. Maybe that helps to resolve it. Anyway, a question came in. Let me ask that question. So this is from John Rogers in California.
Oh, hi, John.
You know John?
I know John Rogers, yeah.
Okay, good. Maggie, you have had conversations with a number of people, many of whom are familiar to the Batgap community. Based on those conversations, what would you say are the 3 most common myths about awakening, aside from the myth that you never get the flu anymore?
Speaking of my flu, this is a great question, actually. Oof. I would say, well, the first myth I think we kind of covered. To me, this is the biggest, which is that this awakening / enlightenment only happens to a special kind of a person that has something, right? I would even go, so I would say this is a myth. I think it's absolutely available to everybody who's basically interested. And if someone is not interested in it, that's okay. That's okay too. And I would say there's a myth that there needs to be a perfect condition for awakening. Because I know from my own journey, but also from just hearing other people, that people wake up in so many different circumstances. Sometimes people who never were even interested in awakening in the first place. That we would deem imperfect conditions, like, I don't know, being on drugs or sitting in a pub. I know of someone working literally in the pub over a pint of Guinness, and stuff like that. So people with
sounds
addiction.
Like Jack O'Keefe on her first awakening. That's exactly what happened.
Really? That's
it might have even been Guinness. Yeah,
there you go. It might have been. That would make sense. They would have been Guinness, but no, it was actually someone else. But either way, there is
maybe there's something special about Guinness.
Oh, maybe there's something special about Guinness, right? Cheers to that. But
you should buy stock in the company.
Exactly, good idea. How but yeah, I would say, and if that was true, then the people who are like totally into spirituality should have all this condition to awaken nailed and be awakened already, and we know that that's not always the case. So I would say that's another myth. I think the biggest myth to me is this idea that awakening stops you from being like regular human, that you become someone special that is above everyone else, and that you are immune basically to human condition, right? So by which I mean conditioning, by which I mean all kinds of patterns of behavior, um the things that we actually talked about, which is why we talked about why it's so important to do this kind of work,
Yeah.
the shadow work, the trauma work, and so on. And that somehow awakening is kind of a state that's detached from day-to-day life, basically, with all its problems, with all its challenges, that it's some kind of puts one that's floating on some kind of transcendental cushion above life, unaffected by anything, and so on. So this whole thing about being unaffected, that's dodgy to me. That's like
That's another
red flag.
dimensional thing. It's like when I fell on the pickleball court, my nose
Yeah.
was bleeding, my lip was bleeding, but
Mm.
my pure consciousness wasn't bleeding. It was unaffected,
Yeah.
but the body
Yeah.
was injured, you know?
Yeah.
And that's just a simple example,
Yeah.
but it's one of those paradox things where you're not affected, but you are affected,
Yeah.
depending on which you're talking
Yeah.
about.
I would even say that to me awakening is not complete if the humanness and life day to day is seen as something separate from this,
No, you're
you
right. Yeah.
know right. If it's seen in fact as a nuisance or some kind of obstacle to awakening, then I
Oh,
would
yeah.
question that, right?
It's a vehicle to awakening, not an
Yeah,
obstacle.
because to me there's literally no point in awakening if it doesn't translate to life,
Very
to
good.
day, exactly as it is, as a whether you're a parent or going to work in the office, or I mean, it doesn't matter. It's just, I would say this is like to me the biggest myth and the biggest um disservice. This
Yeah.
idea that this is somehow makes you a special someone, who's somehow detached from life, and so on. And in fact, it can absolutely be the case, because you totally can be stuck in that kind of space, and we talked about it as well, and be very much detached, but kind of numb at the same time. And it's not even detached, it's more like disassociated, really, with a lot of fear of life and a lot of fear of being affected by just day-to-day life and relational dynamics and situations and so on. Then I would definitely question that. And finally, I would say the other myth is of a spiritual perfection that is kind of tied to this, which again puts awakened people on some kind of a pedestal, whether they're teachers or not, and they're expected not to be human and not to have the same issues as everyone else, because as if that awakening wiped them all out. And that, to me, that's another myth, which is why to me, the more human the teacher and the more open and honest about their human struggles and human challenges, the more likely I am to look up to this person or trust them, to be honest.
Yeah.
The more there's like this like unmoved persona that's unaffected by and whatever, then I get suspicious. Yeah.
Yeah. Perhaps a good nutshell summary of that point, and see if you agree, is that a nice proof of the pudding for spiritual development or awakening is that it enhances life. It doesn't
Mm.
it doesn't remove you from life in any way. It actually should make life better in many respects, if not all.
Yeah, I
That's
mean, it certainly makes moving through life very, very different, but that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a life devoid from challenges. I suppose that would be another myth, you know,
Yeah.
that there's still illness, there's still the flu, you know, there is still some annoying things, you know, happening. There's massive problems, and I would even say, you know, that in that stage between the first shift and other awakenings, there was a kind of living in denial, and that kind of what I would call now spiritual detachment. But it meant that I had inability. It was because I was not able to be with emotional discomfort of my own, or any kind of disturbances of any kind that would affect me, let alone that of other people or the world. So I would rather not look. So I would rather not deal with a lot of things. Whereas for me, the realization, especially the last shift, actually completely changed that. That you know, I had to learn to be with my own pain, and that helped me be with the pain of other people, and with the pain of the world as well, without maybe being crushed by it, like probably I would have been in the past.
Gives you greater resilience and capacity to deal with things, greater equanimity.
Definitely, yeah.
So you said the last shift, and you've in your book, you mentioned many times the phrase "stumbling on isness." Did we adequately discuss that today? Or
yeah, I would call it. Yeah, that's the best way, because I think the reason why I call it isness, because there really all that came through that I could say was like, wow, there's just this. It was just like, and so there was no word. I actually, to be honest, and I think I said it in a book, that I thought I was never going to talk about awakening again. I actually am not surprised after that moment that in the past people were known to have just gone to some cave for, you know, or just I never talk about any of this. I'm not surprised. But you know now, after over 2 hours, Rick, that me and not talking would be rather difficult fit to achieve. So I somehow, I somehow end up talking about it. And even with the book, you know, I honestly, I was writing this book without any idea why I was writing it or who it was even for, other than feeling like it had to be written, and I just could not finish it. It just had to be done, you know. But yeah, I think I think what's amazing about that bit is that really there are absolutely no words there's no kind of I can talk about emptiness a bit. I can talk about nothingness a bit. I can, describe certain things. But with the stumbling on easiness, there's really no words to say, to describe it in any way. You know, other than there was no kind of, I call it like the end of having any kind of a landing place.
Yeah, I think the Tao Te Ching says something like the Tao that can be described is not the Tao, or something like that,
or something. You know, but you just run out of like. You just run out. There's just like there's not anything that can be said about the isness that can like be. There's no arriving to any conclusion. There's no arriving to any statement about it at all. You know.
Well, that's probably a good point to end on.
But it was actually possible to run out of words for a bit, Rick, believe it or not. Yeah, that happened.
Yeah, so thanks, Maggie. It's been great having this conversation with you, and let's stay in touch. Maybe we can talk on WhatsApp sometime while we're both walking in the woods.
Yeah, definitely. It's been great, and I'm really honored and grateful for the opportunity. As I said at the beginning, Buddha the Gas Pump is an institution, and in the best sense of the word. And yeah, thank you so much, Rick.
Oh, you're welcome, and thanks to those who've been listening or watching. And we'll see you for the next one.